Well done, everybody, for quietening down when the music turned off. Welcome, everyone, to this special Sam Reed event. We're really delighted to have been asked by Penguin to put this on with two members of Cumbrian literary royalty. I'm Polly Atkin from Sam Reed's. I'm one of the co-owners of Sam Reed Bookseller in Grasmere. If you have pre-ordered books, you might already have picked them up from the stall. But if not, you can buy them at the stall afterwards if you haven't already done so. Rory will be signing and dedicating books afterwards. He's already signed them all, but if you want to hang around and get them dedicated as well, he will be here. And we have some of James's books as well, so do please visit the bookstall afterwards. I'm going to introduce both of our special guests now and then bring them onto the stage. So I'm sure, really, that neither of them need any introduction, but I will do it anyway because you never know. So Rory is well known to Cumbrians from the decade he spent as a Member of Parliament for Penrith and the Border and his leadership bid against Boris Johnson. He's currently the Brady Johnson Professor of the Practice of Grand Strategy at Yale University's Jackson School of Global Affairs and the co-host with Alistair Campbell of the UK's leading podcast, The Rest is Politics. His Politics on the Edge won the Non-Fiction Book of the Year at the British Book Awards 2024. In August this year, he presented a new series, Rory Stewart, The Long History of Heroism, on BBC Radio 4, examining the changing role of the hero throughout history. We're delighted tonight to be celebrating the launch of his latest book, Middleland, Dispatches from the Borders, which is published this week by Jonathan Cape. Interviewing Rory will be James Rebanks. James is a farmer based in the Lake District. His three books, The Shepherd's Life, English Pastoral, and The Place of Tides, have met with universal acclaim and seen him shortlisted for the Ondaatje Prize, the Wainwright Prize, and longlisted for the Rathbones Folio Prize and the Orwell Prize for Political Writing. So please welcome James and Rory to the stage. And welcome to Rory. So just to let you know a little bit about how this is going to work, James is going to ask Rory questions. Rory is going to answer questions. They're going to have a bit of chat between them. And then in about 45 minutes, we're going to open the floor to questions from you, the audience. I will be running up and down the aisles with a mic with the help of my assistant for the night, Katie Hale, the poet and novelist, who you might also know. So when we do get to that place, please be a little bit patient as we try and reach you. We only have one mic, so stick your hand up very high and wait for one of us to get to you, and we will come to you and hand the mic over so that you can be heard by everybody when you ask your question. So do, as these two wonderful writers speak, be thinking about anything you might want to ask them. Obviously, make sure it's appropriate and to the point. All questions, no comments, please. We will be controlling that. And I will hand over now to James and Rory. Thank you so much.
Good evening. It's a good evening to do a burglary in Cumbria, isn't it? Not recommending that's a good idea, of course. You'll have to bear with me. I'm a little bit nervous. Not because I'm interviewing Rory, although that should make me nervous, or not because lots of you have come, but because my kids have come, and my kids never come to anything. So, Rory, you must have pulling power with the younger generation. I'm going to very briefly sort of set this up by saying, many years ago now, when Penrith and the Borders got a new MP, I remember being absolutely livid. I was absolutely livid. So the candidates who were from the farming background, I think you mentioned in the Politics on the Edge, I knew some of them. I thought, who's this posh lad that they've bloody brought in from somewhere else? Is this how our country works? Why is there nobody local to take this place? And I was a man of strong prejudices. I was determined to hold on to those. And then a little bit later, Rory did a lot of good things, but he did have a misstep at one point where you made some comments about bail string, and don't be mad, he's apologized many times. But I wonder if we could go back, Rory, to that moment when you became the MP for Penrith and the Borders. Could you tell us a little bit about your first impressions when you're an MP, when you get that seat, when you think about that place and you think about what's my duty, what's my role to this place, what are they going to think of me? Because that's the bread and butter of this book that you're going to publish called Middleland. Could you tell us about the beginning of that story of you and Penrith and the Borders?
Yeah, well, thank you first very much all for coming. So I started by walking around the constituency. Penrith and the Border doesn't exist anymore. But it was this magical constituency which stretched essentially from the Ochils right up to the Scottish border, and from the ridges of Helvellyn and Blencathra right the way to the Pennine Ridge up to Alston. And so I began by walking through every village in the constituency, which I think was about just over 100 villages, and then just over 100 hamlets, and tried by doing it to ask people to go walking with me. So I would, Kirby Stephen, the vicar, walked with me. Somewhere outside Hutton in the Forest, I picked up a lurcher. Sometimes I had small groups of people, sometimes I had individuals. I found, of course, maybe this was my mistake about the way I approached it. What I ended up doing is probably spending more time in farms than I would have done if I was just looking at the percentage of the population. Because farmers are very generous. So I would find myself walking along, people would shout at me over a fence, they'd invite me in, I'd be given a meal. And that meant that probably one of the flaws from the beginning is I may not have understood the centre of Penrith as much, and I kept investing more and more probably in the areas outside, and that's probably something I regret.
Okay. Yeah. There's a bit in your book where, and I think lots of us will resonate with this, you said about your childhood, it took me a long time to learn anything about British society. And we're all from little bits of Britain, and we all have these lives where we learn about the other bits. But as you travelled around, walking around, was it the Britain that you knew, or did you get a shock? I think I hear you often reference how poor some of the people were in the rural areas. I know that you used the word primitive, and it annoyed some of us at the time, but there was a bit of truth to that, wasn't there? Which is, people are living at that time, maybe still, on not very much money in remote places. Was it the Britain you knew, or were your eyes being opened?
No, I think my eyes are opened all the time. I think that's one thing. So at the time when I became the MP in Penrith and the Border, the average income being reported by Hill Farms was £8,000 a year. And even with the complexities of how you report your farm income, that is very, very little money. When Willie Whitelaw took over as the MP in the late 50s, early 60s, a third of the houses in the constituency had no indoor lavatory, and a quarter had no electricity. And that wasn't very long ago. But the other thing that I think is so strange becoming an MP is, what does it mean to represent people? I mean, how can I represent you, for example, right? I come from a very different background. But also, how can I represent a woman? How can I represent somebody living on benefits? How can I represent somebody from minority ethnic background? How can I represent somebody with a completely different life experience? How do I represent somebody who's disabled? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Just imagine, every one of you, 700 people in this room, are going to be saying, what on earth is this guy doing speaking for me, right? But our whole system of representative democracy is set up on this very strange idea, which is, even though in our normal lives, you wouldn't want me saying, I represent you, and certainly a woman wouldn't want me saying, I represent a woman, right? If I try to write a book in the voice of an African-American woman, somebody might be like, whoa, hold a sec, what do you think you're doing? But as a member of parliament, we're engaged in this very strange thing. And the final thing is, of course, even at the most, I had only 60% of people voting for me. 40% of people in the constituency didn't vote for me, but I'm representing them as well. But those 40%, by definition, don't want me to be the MP in the first place.
Well, I think what's charming about this book, so this book is a series of dispatches, which I think in their original form you wrote for the Cumberland and Westmorland Herald, and you've reproduced as a way to sort of show that journey of you getting to know this place, you grappling with the issues. And I think what's charming about the book, and the reason many of us stopped disliking you and have grown to like you, is that there's no barbs.
That's a relief. This could
no
go very badly.
Is that we sense that you're trying hard to overcome those differences. You're trying hard to listen. You're trying hard to know what a hill farm is. You're trying hard to understand what our lives are like so you can do that job as well as possible. And I think when I got interested in you, I thought, who is this person and where do they come from? So do you mind if I ask you some questions about where you came from? So I want you to tell us a little bit about your childhood and the values that shaped your childhood. Could you give us a sort of portrait of your childhood? Because it was very different to mine, but I find it interesting and I haven't heard you talk about it very much.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I was born in Hong Kong, and my father was 50 when I was born. So my father had been in the Black Watch during the war. His one of two brothers, and my grandfather was in India from 1899 to 1947. So we were Scots, but a very strange kind of Scots, because then my father spent 50 years living in China, and my grandfather had spent 50, 60 years living in India. My father saw my grandfather 3 times before he was 21.
Wow.
Because my grandfather was only given leave once every 4 years to come back from India. And one of these leave periods, he was ill, so he didn't come back. So my father says that when he went out, he was deployed for the invasion of Japan to India. He'd been in D-Day, Normandy. He was wounded, recovered. Turns up in India and sees his father. And I said, what was it like seeing your father when you'd only met him 3 times? And he said, well, it was very strange because, of course, my father didn't really know me, and my brother had been killed in Sicily, killed in the invasion of Sicily. So that's one part of my story. Yeah. We then moved to Malaysia when I was 6, and there I grew up with a father who was very large in life. He'd been a spy. He was the deputy head of the British intelligence service. He landed in a miniature submarine off the coast of Indonesia. He looked a bit like a sort of strange James Bond figure. He drove an Aston Martin, which wasn't very subtle. He had a little pistol on his dashboard, and he...
Sorry, he had a real pistol on his dashboard?
Real pistol on his dashboard, yeah. And at the weekends, he would take me into the jungle, and he would make rafts out of rubber tires. And we'd take bacon and egg sandwiches, which was a bit dubious because Malaysia is a Muslim country, so quite what we thought we were doing, taking pork products into the jungle, was not very clear. And then we would float down this jungle river, and that was our weekends.
And I'm going to sort of phrase this as delicately as I can. I think some of us, when we're imagining that childhood, might think, oh, your dad sounds tough, he sounds efficient, he sounds like a guy that would get things done. And I've heard you write about him in old age with great affection. But that dad that's taking him out with the bacon and egg sandwiches into the jungle, is he, forgive the bluntness, is he a good dad? Is he affectionate? Is he a man of that era, not very affectionate? What kind of dad is he? Because I sense that you were close.
Very close. No, he was a wonderfully affectionate father. I think partly because he hadn't really had much from his own father.
Okay. It could have gone the other way. Could have gone the other way.
And because he'd lost his brother.
Yeah.
And his brother had been everything to him because they'd grown up together in they'd grown up in rural Scotland together. Yeah. And he was almost over the top in playing. I've got an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old now. And to be honest, I get a little bit bored sometimes playing. My father never gave the impression that. He would lay out little soldiers on the floor when I was 6 for sort of 3-4 hours at a time. Yeah. He'd wake up every morning at 6 to play with me for 3 hours before he went to work. Wow. So he was a very... But I think, in retrospect, some of this is him recovering a childhood with his brother that he'd lost totally.
Because I think the stereotype that many of us would believe in is that the sort of upper middle class male with that war experience would be emotionally cold, maybe a terrible father, packs you off the... But that's not...
Well, he packed me off to boarding school when I was 8. That's true, yeah. And that is true. But as he pointed out, he'd been sent to boarding school when he was 7, so it's a definite huge improvement. And my grandfather, I think, had been 6, so I think the whole thing got getting better.
And go on, let's go there. The boarding school part of this, I haven't heard you speak about that. Is the boarding school part of your childhood a happy memory, a difficult memory? What is that when you look back?
The first thing is that it's when you live in Malaysia and you're sent out as a little boy, aged 8, to a boarding school in Oxfordshire, the first thing you notice is it's very cold. And I turned up in a batik shirt and a pair of shorts, and I think the other boys thought this was a little bit strange.
Yeah.
But the only secret I had is that I'd done a lot of martial arts because I'd grown up in Asia. So my basic identity was this kind of mad, kind of mini kung fu creature.
I'm now starting to see you in a whole different light. Like you look like Bruce Lee a little bit now that you mention it. Yeah. And sorry, that reminds me of one of my favourite books is Empire of the Sun by J.G. Ballard, and there's a really sad bit at the end of that book where this little boy who's grown up in Singapore or Hong Kong, Shanghai, sorry, comes to England and thinks he's English, but of course has never been in England or barely ever been in England. Did it feel like your country? I mean, this is a very classic colonial story in a way, isn't it? Did Britain, did England feel like home, or did it feel a bit alien?
No, it feels like home, but I think one of the problems with living abroad is you develop a very romantic picture of Britain, because what you know, particularly if you've got a father like mine, he's obsessed with British history, and I mean, in his case, of course, the British Empire. So he'd been a colonial officer from 1945 to 56 independence. So so his image of the country was the Second World War, the British Empire, British India, which was his childhood, and his regiment. So I went. He was in the Black Watch. I went into the Black Watch, and he was in the Foreign Office. I went into the Foreign Office. And part of the thing as I grew older, I realized, is that all these institutions were decaying and collapsing. Yeah. And my father, I think, felt this. He felt the British Army wasn't the army he'd been in during the war. He felt the Foreign Office wasn't the Foreign Office he'd been in. So there are 2 risks, I think, of looking at the country from abroad. One is that you can develop a very romantic picture. Yeah. And the second risk is that you can begin to think that everything's changing too fast, that everything's going wrong.
And does that in a way explain your conservatism, which is, because I've been fascinated by other interviews you've done, and because I think your worldview is so different from mine, I wanted to understand why, and I found you a really useful guide to why. And you think I'm mocking, but I'm not. I'm absolutely serious about this. And we've exchanged messages on social media and emails, 1 or 2 things, just starting to dig into this. But I wanted to ask you because I started drawing a diagram when I was preparing for this, and it was the things that seemed big in your upbringing and your father's values, and in yours. It was the sort of state, the monarchy, the army, the church, and we feature in it as well. And I think we feature with a flattering image of the sort of peasantry or farming people. Yeah, I don't even think that's an insulting term.
To be fair, I don't think I used that word.
No, you didn't. I did. I think I don't hate the expression.
I think the word is yeoman farmers.
Yeoman farmer. Okay, we'll go with that. The Europeans would call us the peasantry. And I was really shocked when I began to sort of dig into who's Rory, what's Rory's worldview about. I was shocked that it was about those things, and I suddenly realised that my world wasn't. It was interesting as a mirror.
What was your world about?
So my mum, who's here tonight, who embarrassingly bought a ticket and hasn't let me pay her back yet. My mum would be part of the Church of England and would do her best when we were kids to put us in the choir in the little village school. And the army sort of didn't figure at all on the farming side of the family because they didn't really end up in armies in the last 100 years. On my mum's side, they were industrial workers in Lancashire. Her grandfather had been killed on the Somme a few months before the Battle of the Somme at a place called Miramont. Her dad had fought in Burma, So there's an interesting sort of crossover there. So on my mum's side, those things figured, and we'd played a role in them. But our whole farming world didn't really think about the church only figured as the vicar coming around on a Sunday and sort of irritating my dad, because my dad's trying to watch the horse racing and the vicar wants to talk about God. It's like, when's this man going to leave? This has nothing to do with me. And the army didn't figure. So for those things to figure so big as the sort of architecture of your worldview really shocked me when I started looking into it. But it sounds very much like you got that from your dad. It sounds like your dad can play with you, but you inherited a very strong... I mean, I think lots of us like you and admire you the more we get to know you, because there's a very strong sense of service and duty. And I think it was when I was watching debates or commentary on Boris Johnson that I began to realize that there's good versions and bad versions of people from your background, right? Because duty is a huge thing to your father and yourself, right?
Yeah, I think it's something that is maybe changing in Britain, and it's one of the issues that we have. I was very lucky. I went to Eton, this very fancy school, but out of my year, so just over 200 boys, 56 of us joined the army, and I don't think people completely understand that. Yeah. And that's not a particularly well-paid job. It's not, and a lot of us then went into the civil service, and I think that's probably dying. I think that culture, which my father was very much part of, and which I very much wanted to be part of. And so when I was at university, I never, other people were sort of looking for jobs in law firms or banks or consultancy companies. I never wanted to do that. I wanted to be Lawrence of Arabia.
I'm glad you mentioned him, because I didn't know whether I should, but yeah. Because the heroes are people like Lawrence of Arabia or the young Winston Churchill, right? You go out into the world. I think there's a bit in here where you say about, as a child, you wanted your life to be like a storybook, or words to that effect. So that was it, right? You had these exciting stories about people like you that would go out into the world and do things, save people.
And how did that work in your life? What would be the equivalent in terms of stories and narratives?
We didn't go anywhere. You went to Penrith Tup Sale or Castle Douglas Bull Sale, and you had the... So...
you must have had you must have had people you looked up to, role models, heroes.
100%.
Maybe your grandfather, for example, in your book. I remember there's an amazing moment in English Pastoral when you're on a tractor following your grandfather.
100%. Yeah. So when I was looking
at the back of his neck, I remember. Yeah.
Well, in my early 20s, when I managed to get into Oxford University, there was a tendency there to think that I'd crawled in from a ghetto or something. And I had to point out to people, no, I'm from a farm in Cumbria. That's about halfway up the bloody social ladder. That has enormous privileges with it. And you're absolutely right. I had role models who'd had a degree of status in our world. It's a little world, but you could have status by being a good stockman, by being a good farmer, by looking after the land well, by being a good horse person, by making money, by buying land. There were a whole bunch of ways that you could earn respect. And you're absolutely right. I fixated on my grandfather because he looked like he'd been one of those farming patriarchs. You're absolutely right. And when you travel through life, you feel less lonely if there's somebody to fix on, right?
And I think there's something here which I felt in Cumbria, and it's quite rare in Britain, is that, and maybe it's because we're more sparsely populated, but it is possible, as you say, for people to have identities, roles, respect in a way that isn't so true if you were in a commuter belt on the edge of London. I mean, so there's something difficult, right? Which is that, and it's the theme I keep coming back to in the book, the number one driver at the moment in the United States for voting for Donald Trump is unhappiness. And they measure that by asking people, do you think your life is, on the whole, more good than bad or more bad than good? If you say your life is more bad than good, it is a more accurate predictor of a Trump vote than age, whether you're white, whether you're employed, whether you've got a university education. And one of the interesting things in Cumbria is that the majority of people that I worked with if I'd asked them if their lives were more good than bad, would say more good than bad. And actually, it comes across in national statistics. Penrith and the Border often featured as second or third happiest constituency in Britain, despite the fact that, as you point out, average incomes were very low, lives were very tough, people might feel very marginalized, but there's still something going on. And part of that is your story about your relationship with your grandfather, and also the sense that there are lots of roles that you can look at.
Or there's a structure that you fit in that you feel is meaningful, that you can have a role in. Yeah, it's yeah. So I want to get back to Penrith and the Borders when you're the MP here. There's a quote in the book, and I thought you were writing about Iraq, but I think you might as well have been writing about Penrith and the Borders. You wrote, I think the basic problem with Iraq is that people simply don't understand what they were doing, didn't understand what they were doing. They had a fantasy in their minds of a country that didn't exist. And I think the thing that shines out from this book, Middleland, that we're here to talk about, is the mismatch between the way people think about governing the country in Westminster and what you're finding as you walk around or you're doing surgeries at booths or whatever it might be. It doesn't fit, right? The way the politics is thinking and the way that the real world is operating that you're beginning to see through your eyes as you're there. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think it's one of the most interesting historical things about the book.
Well, I mean, let's look at the government at the moment. So Keir Starmer is talking about growth. And sometimes they talk about productivity and they talk about efficiency. But if you think about your individual lives and what you want in your own business, in your own community, in your own house, that word growth doesn't necessarily describe it. It's not a very useful word. And part of the issue is that Cumbria is much more complicated than anyone in London can see. It's much more fine-grained. That's a pompous way of saying that 25% of my constituents worked from home, 27% were self-employed, 92% worked for businesses employing less than 10 people. And the vision from London is industrial policy, which is big factories. You know, literally there was I was saying to James before we came on, I was talking to a Labour advisor yesterday who said, what we need to draw the country in 4, and we need to decide the industrial policy for each quarter. So the Northwest could do software. And I was thinking, out of your mind, right? I mean, if I walk down the street in Langwathby, you know, knocking on the door, right? The first person I meet might be the brother of a farmer who is also a best-selling writer and prize-winning poet.
Sister.
As well as being the headmistress of the local school. The next door I knock on might well be somebody who is, I don't know, a retired school teacher from Manchester who is helping to organize the half marathon, volunteering for the mountain rescue, and producing chutney out of their back door, right? The next, I don't need to continue because you are them, right? So the point is that Cumbria is an amazing array of James, who is in some ways kind of a representative of a very, very ancient, settled, unusual tradition that exists almost nowhere in Britain. And a lot of this book is about what is happening to the 2,000 small farms, right? And the way in which they're under pressure and the way in which they're folding and merging and how 2,000 is going to become 1,000 and how actually there will be fewer people like James. But it's also a book about the fact that even James isn't James. Because if you actually look at James, it's a much more complicated story. His sisters are doing more complicated things. His mother has a more complicated story. He's writing books about going off to Scandinavia to study women who are collecting eider geese feathers, right? None of this stuff you would guess necessarily when you see him at the Heskett Newmarket show.
So one of the threads running through this that I think you're trying to work out throughout that period, over those years, is what is government for? What can government do in this place? And how can I, as part of government, make that work better? And I'm still grappling with what the answer is from the book. Is the answer that we're all so diverse, we're all so fragmented. We're all those things you just said. So we need, and I want to know your views here. Is the answer that we have very small government that does a handful of things really well, and then what, we devolve everything down to the local level? I think, although you didn't go on very well with him personally, I think you're not against the big society idea of David Cameron, right? Could you elucidate what you think the moral of that period of time is?
I think the moral of the story is that you can't run everything from London. It doesn't matter. Look, we could tell a story about Cumbria, and that would be a story about how you balance small upland farms with some extraordinary businesses. I mean, if you Geldwen and the Penrith industrial estate will be manufacturing 1 million doors a year, like 30% of the doors in the country, with 100 people out of an industrial estate on the edge of Penrith. But nobody in London can see all this variety. But it's equally true with Manchester. If you want an industrial policy from Manchester, it needs to be driven by Manchester, right? And Cumbria needs to be driven by Cumbria. But it's also true that, as James says, it's partly about devolution. It's partly about giving real people a voice. I started with this question of representation. Look, collectively, you know much, much more about Cumbria than I do as an individual, but collectively you also know much more about Cumbria than James does as an individual, right? Because there's 700 of you. And one of the problems is, what does it take to tap all that energy and wisdom? How do you set up structures that allow people to run their own lives? And a lot of this book is about the fact that Crosby Ravensworth, for example, built its own affordable housing. It had no affordable housing. They built 27 beautiful affordable houses in the middle of their own village, in the way they wanted, in the design they wanted, and had young families in there much more quickly than the government could do. Libby Bateman in Malastang ran fiber optic cable 9 miles up a farm track with a mole plow because people weren't getting broadband in. And I just kept thinking, how do we design a structure that unleashes that kind of energy and gets the government out of the way?
But isn't even thinking like that from... I got nostalgic reading this book back to a time where things seemed to make sense. Like, you trying to work that out made sense to me. But we're living in an age where things are collapsing and unraveling all around us, right? We seem to barely get confidence from any kind of government at the moment. We're seeing this sort of media fragmentation with social media, so we're all getting different news from each other. It feels like the opposite of even small competent government. It feels like there's a sort of unraveling happening. It feels now almost naive to think we could have good governance for rural areas because we're in such a mess on the big stuff. Is that too pessimistic?
I think it's part of the problem is I'm afraid, social media. This book starts in 2009. It starts just after the launch of Twitter and Facebook, just at the moment where the smartphone was launched. And the whole world changes. I was thinking about this because at the moment, I'm in London a lot when I'm not in the States, and the basic vision that you get of London in America is that London is a kind of Islamic state run by knife-wielding maniacs who'll cut you up as soon as you step on the streets. And Americans literally say to me, "Oh my God, are you all right? You're going to London?" You know, because they get these images on TikTok, right? And it's the same, I'm afraid, in British politics. There was a very strange moment where the editor of The Spectator, who's not exactly a left-wing guy, that's a right-wing magazine, challenged Nigel Farage and said knife crime is coming down. There are fewer people being killed with knives than was true last year and fewer than 2 years ago, etc. And Farage's answer was, but look at your phone. In other words, the whole narrative is being driven by our phones. Yesterday, I had somebody sharing with me an image of a video shot 9 years ago saying, that happened yesterday, why is the police not taking action? So part of the answer is, I'm not sure that Cumbria fundamentally has changed. I think that, and in part this book is, my instinct is that in a world gone mad, in the world of Trump, in the world of Xi Jinping, in the world of Putin, in the world of Ukraine, actually the answer is Cumbria. I mean, the answer to our problem is something like Cumbria.
Which is a very me thing to think and say, but I'm not sure. I think we might have the same problems as everybody else. So I was saying behind the scenes down there that I only go on Facebook to talk about sheep and cows. And the only people I follow on Facebook are farmers. And about 5 years ago, I noticed that people who I thought of as my friends or people I'd known all my life started using these strange expressions for farmers, like mainstream media, and they'd start whinging about the BBC being biased, or horrific phrases like sort of boat people start creeping in, and you think, what's going on here? Even pro-Russian propaganda in the Ukraine war is popping up in farmers' Facebook. Those algorithms find people, don't they? And they prey on their fears. And the same stuff that's happening that's corrupting American politics or our politics at a national level is corrupting our families and our grandparents, right? This is everywhere, this thing, right?
It's everywhere and corrupting our own minds.
Yeah.
And it's fundamental for democracy, because democracy depends on truth. Because if you don't, how can you vote for someone if you don't know what the truth is? How can you hold a government accountable if they don't follow through on their promises, if they lie at the dispatch box, if you can't trust any fact, you've got no information on which to vote?
I'm going to ask the audience a question. Put your hand up if you feel confident that you can affect our democracy to bring about a change that you would like to see.
Okay, I'm going to ask the audience a question, right?
Okay.
How many people in this audience, roughly speaking, in the end, think their lives are more good than bad? Okay. And how many people in the audience follow my instinct, which is, and by all means disagree with me, please, because I may be completely off my trolley, right? That actually, in some ways, when we're getting in a complete panic about Britain and the crisis of Britain, it might be a good idea to concentrate on places like Cumbria, because in fact there are things here that are very, very positive and very fulfilling and actually make sense in terms of meaning of people's lives. Who's positive about Cumbria?
Yes. I'm glad, that isn't a defeat. I'm glad that people are positive about Cumbria. So what are we going to do, right? What are we going to do? There's 700 of us. That's quite a lot of thinking people of Cumbria and book-reading people of Cumbria. What are we going to do? Because it can feel pretty daunting. So my question suggests that politically we're all absolutely hopeless, without hope, doesn't it? Yeah. What are we going to do to retake the information space so that truth means something once more?
I think
and politics works for us rather than us becoming all apathetic.
Well, I think one thing is to be local, quite local, because it's easier to lie to people about national and international things than it is to lie about local things, right? It's quite difficult to claim that Langwathby is an Islamic state if you're living in Langwathby, right? You might obviously believe it if you lived in Lazenby, but if you're actually living in Langwathby, it's quite difficult.
I've got to interrupt here. My sister, when she was at secondary school, did a project about history, and they had to pick a historic moment and look through the local lens as to how it had affected people. And I think she did the outbreak of the Second World War. And the headline of the Cumberland and Westmorland Herald in the week that the Second World War broke out was that Langwathby was going to get a new village hall. And so we're not necessarily the most globally minded people, are we?
The second thing is, as well as local, I think we could really innovate. So I would love Cumbria to embrace citizens' assemblies. Now, it is a word that everybody hates, but I am such a believer in. So just to explain quickly to people who don't understand how they work, the point is that you would select 300 people at random, demographically representative from the constituency or from the county, to look at an issue and come up with a recommendation. And what we find when these things are done, they were done amazingly in Ireland. Ireland's a very good example. So Ireland, Catholic country, massive fight about abortion. They had a citizens' assembly, and over the course of 2 weeks, ordinary people, it's like a jury, ordinary people, normal people, selected randomly, not politicians, came up with a solution that has actually solved the issue for Ireland. And my gut instinct is that the problem that we have with representative democracy is the idea that you send someone like me to Westminster and that you have these parties, doesn't matter whether they're Labour, Conservative, Reform, Green, Lib Dem, as opposed to what we should do, which is recognize our country's changed. We've never been so educated. We've never had a country like this where every single one of you in the room, put together with a group, I think I would trust. I would trust you to know more about Cumbria than somebody from the outside. And we need to develop systems, mechanisms, structures, local structures which allow you to take control of your own areas and make those decisions.
But don't we still need the centre to step up, to do its job, to raise the money, to send us the money to work with?
There's some things the centre needs to do, of course. There are many, many things the centre needs to do. I'm not suggesting, obviously, there are extreme things the centre needs to do. I mean, you're not going to be building an army or getting tanks. The centre is still going to need to duel the A66. It's going to have to finance an education system, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't have much more control over the local schools, right? There will have to be redistribution because Britain is a complicated area where there are poorer and wealthier areas, and some of the money needs to be shared from wealthier areas to poorer areas. But basically, budgets should be devolved, decision-making should be devolved. We should at least have something that feels much more like what happens in so many European countries, of having power much more at a local level. It doesn't make sense to have such a centralized country.
Pregnant pause. So what? Okay, I'll give you that. What are we going to do with the information space so that we get back to truth, not performance? And what are we going to do with government itself? Because there's zero faith in the room. We established that with my loaded question. And I now have zero faith. So to give you my example, I probably spent as much time as anybody, except for maybe 20 people, lobbying government to care about farming, to invest in sort of nature-friendly farming, to try and make our landscapes better, to think about farming, food, and environment together. And I feel like the whole damn effort was a waste of time. And when I look back at it, I think, who was I lobbying? And what a waste of time was that? Because ultimately it comes down to the Chancellor, a couple of advisors in the Treasury. They come up with a spreadsheet. They cut the budget to farming. They don't care about rural. They don't care about the stuff I or you might care about. That makes me very disillusioned. I think, should I devote the next 20 years to talking to politicians and people who claim they're going to be the next government? And if I'm not doing that, how depressing is that?
Well, I look. Firstly, it's very depressing,
Yeah.
and it's heartbreaking, and the problem is that, in the end, you were doing an amazing job, but you were coming too late, because people hadn't made the right arguments for 50 years. So for 50 years, people were not making the arguments for farming in Britain in the right way. The NFU weren't doing it in the right way. The politicians weren't doing it in the right way. The Tories were obsessed with market efficiency. The left was basically had its votes in urban areas, didn't really think about rural areas. And we were relying on the European Union, and in particular, French farmers, to make the arguments for small farms. And when we left the European Union, we hadn't developed the muscles to know how to make these arguments, and we were naive. Yes, but the solution to this, again, to return to my obsession, is that if the power over those decisions on financing a rural economy sat in Cumbria, not in London, you would be much more likely to be able to win a hearing and much more likely to get public money flowing in that way.
The clearest version of that I've ever heard that sort of backs up what you just said is, I was talking to Minette Batters, and she said, James, the problem, people didn't realize the problem with Brexit is that there's no one in Westminster whose job it was to think about the minutiae of agricultural policy. Those people are French, they're German, they're Italian, they're in Brussels, and they're doing the thinking for us. And if you're in the Tory Party or the Labour Party or the Lib Dems, you probably don't think this is something you need to do because it's outsourced to Europe.
But also, James, there's another problem, which maybe you got to when you were teasing me about the idea of my having kind of affection for peasants, right? The problem is this, that in Norway or in Japan or in France, you can say small traditional family farms are the bedrock of our culture. This is our heritage. If you're Japanese, you really believe this. Japan is about small family farms. In Norway, they will literally fund people to keep farming a fjord. Right? And that's what the Common Agricultural Policy was built on. In Britain, somebody like me saying, no, I'm not actually primarily interested in giving money to huge estates in East Anglia to grow a lot of barley. I'm not particularly interested in giving a huge amount of money to large estates and United Utilities to rewild. What I care about is keeping small family farms going, because this is a direct link back through 5,000 years of history. This is our heritage. This is all that's left of tradition and culture in Britain. You say that in Britain, quite quickly, even allies of mine, like James, will immediately tease you and say, so you're saying we should keep going in some sort of quaint tourist peasant farming, right? Yeah. Which nobody would say in France, nobody would say in Norway.
And perhaps the most depressing thing I've ever read was the bit in your book, The Politics from the Edge, where you are a DEFRA minister. You go in with great excitement to your first meeting with Liz Truss, and you've read it, yeah. It's horrific, isn't it? You lived it, we only read it. But correct me if I'm wrong. So in that first meeting, she says, Rory, I don't want you to be interesting, which made me laugh out loud. We're here to cut the budget by 25%. Is that a fair reflection of that meeting? That's the moment where I think, geez, even when we get the right person in the room, that's how this thing works?
No, that was the most depressing job I did. The most fulfilling job I did, strangely, was being the prisons minister. Because actually, I felt I could improve things. I could, partly because prisons were so bad, it was possible to see how to make things a bit better. But the environment minister job was heartbreaking. I came in having spent 5 years thinking about these issues with so many clear ideas about what I wanted to do. And I wanted to start, given that one of the things I'm obsessed with was trying to save small family farms, the first thing I wanted to do was get DEFRA to agree to count how many farms there were 10 years ago, how many 5 years ago, and how many now. They wouldn't do it. They literally would not do it. Month after month, I pushed and heard a different excuse for why this data couldn't be gathered and why they couldn't look at it. I tried to get involved in, well, I think like James. I mean, James has a much more thoughtful, much more grounded, much more realistic idea of this, but what I think I share with him is that I don't want to live in a version of the United States where we either have Kansas, in other words, square gridded, treeless industrial agriculture, or Alaska, rewilded wildernesses. I want farming with a lot of nature. And I love a patchwork landscape. I could see that farms could carry some more trees. Maybe it was only 3-4 trees per hectare, right? Doing simple things like that, even with all the kind of confidence, energy, drive, pushing, I'm facing Liz Truss. I'll finish on this as a sort of sign of her personality. So as James says, I was in charge of the national parks, and she said to me, Rory, I've been talking to a businessman who said every business can be cut by 25%. So I want you to cut the budgets of the national parks by 25%. So I said, but Secretary of State, the national parks got a very small budget. The Lake District National Parks only got £1.5 million a year, and cut it by 25%, we won't save much money, and about a third of the people who come to the Kendal Leisure Centre on a Tuesday evening will be really angry. So another third might be quite happy. So please don't do it. So she said, oh, okay, Rory, for you, 5%. So I said, but Secretary of State, if you're cutting it by 5%, I mean, you're literally just going to anger everybody and save no money at all. And she said, okay, for you, Rory, I won't cut it at all. And then she literally spun 360 degrees and walked out of my office. And I just started thinking, who has ever had a boss like that? And what is going on in that minute and a half in her head?
And it sounds like it sounds like those experiences finish you off, and you think, it isn't these people that's going to make this country better. It's Libby with a mole plough, and we need to somehow harness the power of these people. Okay, I still want my government to do the basics well, and I'm a little confused how that's going to happen.
No, but part of the issue is that we've also got to work out who we want in government.
Yeah.
Now, you quite rightly teased me about my background, but one of the things that annoys me when I interview Rachel Reeves or Bridget Phillipson is all they want to talk about is their background. So the first 5-10 minutes of all those interviews is them reminding you just how poor their mother was, how tough their upbringing was, how difficult it was. They're very, very proud about the fact that not a single person in the cabinet went to private school. Fine, great, but we've also got to care about performance.
And sorry, what you're implying there is they're using that for cover for the fact that they're actually professional politicians. They're
they're making politics about identity. Now, it's fair enough, right, to say the country's been run roughshod over by posh people like me. That's fine. We should be cutting that down. But ultimately, what you want from a politician is not really the question of what their identity is, what their background is. How good are they doing the job? If you're trying to run Cranston's, it's not actually very important how poor your mother was. The question is, how well can you run Cranston's, right?
Thank you. For anyone in my family, there's lots of references that are quite interesting tonight to do with like Wealthby, Cranston's, where my two sisters work. I think we're going to throw this open to questions. Please put your hand up if you'd like to ask Rory a question. There's about 1 million things I wanted to ask him that I haven't asked him, but the time's flown by incredibly quickly.
We have 15 minutes for questions now, so Katie and I are going to try and move quickly and try and be concise when you ask your questions.
Hello. So I run a small-scale forestry business in Dumfries and Galloway, and I often find when I'm talking to farmers, you get two responses. One is forestry is a nightmare, it's tearing up all the good ground, it's a wreck, we need to get rid of it. I must admit that came a little bit out in your Newsnight interview the other week, Rory. And I'm curious, from a policy perspective, what do you think the government could be doing to encourage forestry and farming to cooperate better and see the benefit of one another as they do in the continent?
You had very big battles about trees, didn't you?
Yeah. Look, I think the answer is a proper plan, a strategic plan for mixed use of the landscape. I think there's a huge role for forestry. I think it's a very important employer. It produces incredibly important things for building our houses. It's a very major industry in our economy. But that does not mean driving trees across small traditional family farms and creating subsidy systems that basically wipe them out. And government needs to think it through. There's place for all these things, but we need to decide in advance. Let's take the area that you're working in, Dumfries and Galloway. By all means, Kielder, Kership are large commercial forests, but the Bailey Valley doesn't need to be a large commercial forest. By all means, in the Lake District, the RSPB does what it wants to do, maybe, in Swindle, but that doesn't mean that the whole of Ullswater has to be turned over to those kind of projects. Yeah.
And just practically, there's different kinds of forestry, right? There's your sort of commercial forestry with your citrus spruce and what have you. There's a hell of a lot of trees you can get into farmland, as you will well know. So we've, into the sort of 500 acres that we manage, we've got nearly 60,000 trees without any loss of productivity. They're all going in hedges, edges, boggy bits, and we've done a huge amount of work with the Ullswater Community Interest Catchment Company, and they're redesigning our traditional landscapes, restoring our traditional landscapes, all those old hedgerows. We can get massive amounts of trees. I have a lot of sympathy for your idea of the past, which is what's the simplest way to persuade your average farmer to put a lot of trees on their land?
Yeah. So, exactly.
Edges.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I fantasized about when people were getting the single farm payment is to say, as part of your single farm payment, you undertake to plant 9 trees per hectare on your land. But you don't have to plant it all on this hectare. You can choose what to do. You could plant an orchard, you could put them in hedges, you could plant an avenue up to your house. You can choose your trees, and these things will cost £1 a tree with the stake and the tube, and it would transform the landscape, particularly southern England.
I practically think that's not that difficult for the average farmer if they wrap their heads around it. Interestingly, that is sort of part of the Welsh proposals at the moment. And in the age we live in right now, is turning into a real trigger for an increasingly sort of populist right farming movement.
As everyone's getting really angry
Everyone's getting really angry about the 10% trees
yeah.
thing. So the politics of the possible is complicated, isn't it? Yeah.
I hope this works. As to simplify things, 8th generation farmer in the same village on the edge of the Trough of Bowland and on the edge of the Lake District, I remember my grandfather, without the big machinery, had farm men. He could afford them. These days, and I'm asking what the short-term solution is, because I buy into everything you both said, you have 120 acres, and the Tories took us out of Europe, and we lost a lot of money. I voted Labour. I don't want booing, but I thought, really, they don't understand. So I voted for Labour, and I have regretted it enormously since, because we've got Rachel Reeves now squeezing us on the other side. So it is completely impractical and impossible financially to have any help on the farm. So along they come with stewardships, and I'm sorry to be rude, but plant some trees. Costs money, you've got to get someone to plant them. Do some stone walling, we'll give you some money. Same problem, you've got to pay, and even the stewardship doesn't cover things like VAT. So I completely buy into everything you've both said, but the problem is now, my other hat, if you like, is as a listening volunteer for Samaritans. And I go out to veterinary practices and young farmers and things, trying to, make them aware of the help that there is. But the problem, as I keep saying, is now. As a farmer with 120 acres, you can hardly make ends meet. Small example, someone comes and charges you to shear your sheep and you lose money. So what do we do now? Sorry, Rory.
Thank you. No, I think that was a really good intervention. I think what you said was very important and serious. We are very short time. I think we'll take your comment as an important comment and something to reflect on, and then we will just try to bring in another couple of people before we close, if that's right. Yeah.
Person with their hand up at the back, please keep your hand up so I can keep my eyes on you, so I know where I'm running to.
You should, by the way, all buy the books of Katie Hale, who's carrying the microphone. Is a wonderful poet and Cumbrian writer. Yeah.
So when Thatcher shut the mines in the 80s, there was support from the majority of the population, despite protests, on the basis that it was cheaper to import the products that were being produced. And I want to ask, why do you think that attitude has now switched to British farming when it is cheaper to import some farming products?
Rory's thinking, which gives me a couple of seconds to jump in. I'll jump in.
Yeah, please.
I don't want to say anything negative about miners. I think that's an interesting separate topic. But on the food side, our leading expert in Britain, if not in Europe, on food security is a guy called Professor Tim Lang. He's just written a report for the National Preparedness Committee about how strategically food secure we are, faced with various challenges. And the report is absolutely damning. When the First World War broke out, people panicked because we only had 6 weeks worth of food. We have 6 days now. And when I interviewed him for an article, I said, Tim, is there some big shed somewhere full of food if things go something terrible happens? And he said, no, the only food, James, is in Tesco's, in the Tesco wagons, in the depot that they left from, and on the way to the depot from whatever the farmers have produced or coming around the world. It doesn't take very much to take that food system out, and he wrote a very compelling case for us reforming our food system for national security reasons, if nothing else. There's many other reasons why we want a good food system, but national security is one of them.
We've got approximately 2.5 million acres less in production than we had in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And we were very complacent. When I was in DEFRA, everybody said food security doesn't matter. And of course, the Russia-Ukraine war suddenly revealed how much it did matter. Suddenly we understood where our wheat was coming from. Suddenly we realized how vulnerable we were. Yeah.
Just very quickly, there's also some absolutely amazing science about how food transmits the biological health of our soils through meat, through vegetables, into our gut biome, and affects everything from our mental health to our physical health. We all have a vested interest in having a food system which has healthy, biologically active soil, because it's the difference between being healthy and not. And if we're not interested in doing that for our own health or our national security, we're nuts as far as I'm concerned.
Let me add one more annoying point, right? People often say we should be pushing sheep off our hills because it would be great for the environment and we'll rewild. What we then end up doing is we don't stop eating lamb. We just start importing it from New Zealand, or we import it from Argentina. And effectively what we're doing is we're wrecking their landscapes, right? So if you actually care about the environment, you should be working out how to grow your own food in a nature-friendly way in your own country, not exporting your problem to someone else, patting yourself on the back, thinking, I'm doing this great thing for the environment, when actually your consumption is remaining exactly the same. You've just pushed the production problem to somebody else.
And what I would add to that, and I can say this as a farmer, is there is a farmer perspective, and it's growing in this age of populism and sort of TikTok and what have you, that just means that farmers can do whatever they like. I've never bought that. I've never defended that. We do need a lot of trees, as the gentleman pointed out. We do have biodiversity collapse. We do need to get more carbon in the ground. So it becomes about mixed land use, doesn't it? It becomes about asking something more complicated of our farmers than simply producing ever cheaper food. There's a whole bunch of things we need to ask of our farmers to make that work. Yeah.
Time for one more?
One more last question.
There's a very intelligent-looking chap with a beard there.
I'm a very intelligent woman without a beard.
Well done, yay!
Thank you. Rory, it's absolute joy and a delight to have you back in Cumbria. We absolutely adore you. And I remember not very long ago when you decided that you were interested in standing as the Mayor of London. Well, I don't know if you know, but next year we're looking for a new mayor. And really, there's only one man for the job. What do you think about that?
So, any interest, Rory? Any interest in being the...
I just got a very, very firm letter from a dear friend of mine who's thinking of running for that position, telling me under no circumstances whatsoever am I to consider doing this. So I'm currently contemplating this letter carefully and thinking about my...
I'm going to intervene, and we are going to go for one last question down here, because that was more of a comment than a question. Now, I don't want to... Are you sure this is a question? Are you sure? Okay.
I know him. We can evict him if he's a problem.
Rory, with going backwards and forwards in America, how close do you think we are to a Third World War?
Well, look, I think it's a good thing to finish on. I think that we should, I'm afraid, be concerned. The world that is being created by Donald Trump is a world which is about power and his own predatory behavior, and essentially him trying to extract as much as he can from the world while destroying laws and protections for American citizens and internationally. And the way in which he empowers people like Putin, the way in which he is impoverishing his allies, humiliating Canadians, Japanese, South Koreans, Vietnamese, Europeans. The way in which he's destabilizing a very precious, peaceful order that was built up since 1945 should be very, very worrying to all of us. And please, let's not get into a mindset of thinking, well, you know, he's not as bad as Hitler, and therefore everything's fine. Right? The fact that he's not as bad as Hitler does not make everything fine. He is a profoundly dangerous, corrupt, cruel, irresponsible person who is weakening America's allies, weakening the United States, and bringing us much, much closer to catastrophic conflict.
One more, just very quickly. And one final thing. Every time I look at the polls predicting who would win the next election in this country, I'm seeing horrific numbers. Well, horrific to me numbers, for reform. This stuff's coming here, right? There's something has to profoundly change between now and the next election for us not to follow that, right?
Yes, and which is why, I mean, look, the answers to how do we build trust back in government is very difficult. Keir Starmer has got the worst net popularity ratings of any prime minister now since the Second World War. It's unbelievable, the problems that he's in. And the Conservative Party's almost disappeared. We are in a very, very strange system where effectively we've gone from a two-party system to a five-party system. We need to change our electoral system in order to reflect a new reality. We need to devolve power down to places like Cumbria, and we need to make our society not less democratic, but more democratic. We need to give people agency. We need to give people a sense that they can control their lives, that they can fight for the things they care about, for their families, for their neighborhoods, to make things better, to address the practical problems on their doorstep. And that isn't done through clever policy straplines or killer attack lines produced from some young advisor in London. It's produced by a radical overhaul of our democratic system and trusting the British people.
Okay. Thank you. We're going to stop now. I'd urge you all to buy the book. It's a fascinating, almost like a travelogue, I found it. It's like a sort of travelogue of you in my homeland, getting to know it, understand it.
It's like a Norwegian reading your book in place of
Absolutely,
tides.
yeah. What are we doing? Yeah. Anyway, buy the book. It's going to be available outside. I think Rory's going to be signing some for people. Thank you all for coming. I don't think either of us take for granted this many people turning out on a night in Cumbria. I've enjoyed it very, very greatly. There's about 50 questions I wanted to ask you. I'll have to ask you behind the stage on another occasion. But thank you all for turning out. And thank you to Rory for coming and talking to us this evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you again, all of you. Thank you, Rory and James, so much. That was such a fascinating conversation. We have recorded it, hopefully, as well, so you will be able to listen back to some of those points if you need to recover them. As James said, Middleland is for sale upstairs. It's not quite out yet as well, and we do have a slightly special price tonight as well. So do rush up there and get your copies if you haven't already got them. They are all already signed, but Rory will be dedicating books as well. So there's a separate queue for signing. You will be directed into a dedicating queue if you've already got your book. Go to the bookstore, which is in the left-hand corner of the lobby. I'm sure you've already seen it on the way in, to get your book. Thank you all so much for coming. This has been an epic thing for us at Sam Reed to do. If you know Sam Reed's, you know we're a tiny bookshop. There's only 5 of us, all working part-time and all of the hours of the day and night at the same time to do it. We've had lots of volunteer help to make tonight work, and it's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you again, Rory and James, for this fantastic evening.